On the 12th of February 1809, in a substantial brick house overlooking the River Severn, a child entered the world who would one day shake the very foundations of human understanding. The Mount, as the Darwin family home was known, stood solid and prosperous in the market town of Shrewsbury, a place where medieval streets met Georgian sensibility, where ancient churches cast their shadows over a society beginning to stir with industrial transformation. England itself was changing. The Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe, Wellington's armies marched through Spain, and across the Atlantic, Abraham Lincoln drew his first breath on that very same day. Yet within the walls of the Mount, time seemed to move more gently. The household bustled with servants, the garden sprawled across 2 acres, and Robert Darwin, the child's father, had already established himself as one of the most successful physicians in all of Shropshire. Charles Robert Darwin arrived as the 5th of 6 children, a fact that would later seem almost prophetic. Neither the eldest to inherit expectations nor the youngest to be indulged, he would occupy that middle space where observation becomes second nature, where one learns to watch before being watched. His mother, Susanna Wedgwood Darwin, came from a family of potters whose name had become synonymous with fine china and progressive thinking. 2 great family lines converged in this child: wealth meeting intellect, commerce embracing inquiry. The world Charles Darwin was born into carried within it a peculiar tension. The Church of England stood as the bedrock of social order, its teachings unquestioned in polite society. The Bible provided not merely spiritual guidance, but scientific certainty. Archbishop Usher had calculated that God created the world in 4004 BC on October 23rd at 9 in the morning. This was not metaphor but fact, taught in universities, preached from pulpits, accepted without question by nearly everyone who mattered. Yet beneath this certainty, something was stirring. Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, had already published radical ideas about the transformation of species, though wrapped in the safer language of poetry. James Hutton had proposed that the Earth was far older than the Bible suggested, shaped by processes still ongoing. The steam engine had arrived, proving that human ingenuity could harness nature's power. Coal came up from the Earth in quantities that spoke of ages beyond human comprehension. In Shrewsbury streets, change arrived on the hooves of horses pulling coaches, in the smoke rising from new factories, in conversations held in parlours where educated men debated whether lightning was divine punishment or electrical phenomenon. The town maintained its ancient walls, its medieval churches, its timeless rhythms, even as the future pressed at its gates. Charles Darwin's first cry echoed through a house built on Enlightenment wealth, in a town suspended between past and future, in a nation about to enter its industrial zenith, in a world about to be transformed by the very child whose birth went unremarked beyond the immediate family. History had placed him precisely where he needed to be, though no one could have known it then. The boy who would explain life itself had arrived, innocent and unaware, into a comfortable Georgian household where comfort itself would prove his greatest advantage and his most dangerous trap. To understand the man who would revolutionize biology, one must first understand the peculiar advantages and burdens of being born a Darwin. This was no ordinary English family, though they might have appeared so to outsiders. Wealth, yes, they had that in abundance. Respectability certainly carefully maintained. But threaded through the Darwin lineage ran something more dangerous, a tradition of thinking that questioned, observed, and refused to accept the world as it appeared. Robert Darwin, Charles's father, towered over the household in more ways than one. At over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 300 pounds, by his middle years, he dominated every room he entered. As a physician, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose not merely physical ailments, but the hidden troubles of the soul. Patients travelled from across England to consult him, and his fortune grew accordingly. Yet Robert's size and success concealed a more complex character, a man who believed in careful observation, who trusted evidence over tradition, and who worried constantly that his children might embarrass the family name. The shadow of Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, stretched long over the family. Erasmus had been everything the 18th century admired: physician, poet, inventor, natural philosopher. His book, Zoonomia, had proposed that all life descended from a single common ancestor, that species transformed over time through their own volition and need. The idea had scandalized the pious and delighted the radicals. Erasmus had lived boldly, keeping a mistress, fathering children outside marriage, eating and drinking with legendary enthusiasm. He had died 7 years before Charles was born, but his books remained on the shelves, his ideas whispered in conversations. Then there was the Wedgwood connection, equally significant. Charles's mother, Susanna, came from the pottery family, whose innovations had transformed English manufacturing. Her father, Josiah Wedgwood, had been Erasmus Darwin's closest friend, a partnership of minds that produced not merely beautiful ceramics but a fusion of families. The Darwins and Wedgwoods would intermarry repeatedly across generations, concentrating both wealth and perhaps something else, a genetic inheritance that manifested in brilliance and illness alike. Money shaped everything. The Darwin children would never know want, never face the desperate scramble for employment that drove most of England's sons into careers chosen by necessity rather than inclination. This freedom was both blessing and curse. It meant Charles could spend years aboard a ship collecting barnacles. It also meant he could afford to delay publication of dangerous ideas until the time seemed right. Wealth bought him time, and time allowed him to think. But the family legacy carried darker threads. Susanna Darwin, Charles's mother, died when he was only 8 years old. She simply disappeared from his memory so completely that in his autobiography written decades later, he could recall almost nothing of her. His older sisters took over the household management, particularly Caroline, who tried to shape Charles into the respectable gentleman his father demanded. The pressure to conform, to not embarrass the family, to choose a proper profession, would follow him for years. Free thought ran in the blood, but so did caution. Erasmus Darwin's radical ideas had brought social consequences. Robert Darwin had learned to keep his own skepticism private, to attend church for appearance's sake while harboring doubts. This was the inheritance Charles received, the freedom to question everything combined with the social necessity of questioning nothing too loudly. A fortune that bought independence, a family history that encouraged inquiry, and a powerful father who wanted his son to be respectable above all else. From these contradictions, revolution would eventually emerge. The boy who would one day explain all of life began his own by collecting death. While other children of privilege learned their Latin declensions and practiced their penmanship, young Charles Darwin haunted the 2-acre garden of the Mount, gathering beetles, hoarding birds' eggs, watching with endless fascination as caterpillars transformed into butterflies. His hands were always dirty, his pockets full of specimens, his mind absorbed in the small mysteries that adults dismissed as childish curiosities. The garden itself was his first laboratory. His father had designed it with care, creating winding paths, planting exotic species, building spaces for contemplation. Here, Charles learned the patience of observation, discovered that nature revealed her secrets only to those willing to wait and watch. He spent hours studying the habits of insects, noting which flowers attracted which butterflies, memorizing the songs of different birds. While his sisters practiced their watercolors in the parlor, Charles squatted in the mud, examining the structure of a beetle's wing. His education proceeded along conventional lines, or tried to. Dr. Butler's Shrewsbury School stood less than a mile from the Mount, an ancient institution dedicated to drilling Latin and Greek into the sons of gentlemen. Charles hated nearly every moment, The endless conjugations seemed meaningless, the classical texts irrelevant to the living world that fascinated him. He was not stupid, far from it, but his intelligence ran in channels the schoolmasters could not recognize or value. They saw a distracted student, adequate but unremarkable. They could not see the naturalist being born. His older brother Erasmus, named for their famous grandfather, became his partner in secret experiments. Together they set up a chemistry laboratory in a garden shed, mixing compounds, creating small explosions, filling the air with noxious fumes. The other boys at school called Charles Gas because of these experiments, a nickname that stung more than they knew. Science was not yet respectable, chemistry still tainted by its association with alchemy and charlatanism. A gentleman's son should study classics, not play with chemicals like some tradesman's boy. Shooting became an obsession. Charles spent entire days tramping across the countryside with his dog and gun, bringing down game birds with increasing skill. His father worried that the boy would become an idle sporting man, wasting his life and the family fortune in pursuit of pheasants. Robert Darwin could not see that these shooting expeditions were teaching his son invaluable lessons: how to move quietly through nature, how to observe without disturbing, how to understand the behavior of wild creatures. Every bird Charles shot he examined carefully, noting the structure of wings and beaks, the contents of crops and gizzards, the variations between individuals of the same species. The Mount's library offered refuge when weather drove him indoors. Here he discovered Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne, a book that would change his life, though he did not know it yet. White had simply described the natural world around his parish, recording observations with patient detail. Charles read and reread this book, finding in it validation for his own obsessions. Perhaps collecting and observing were not childish wastes of time, but legitimate pursuits, even noble ones. Yet something else was forming in these childhood years, a capacity for focus that bordered on obsession. When Charles became interested in something, he pursued it with relentless intensity. He did not merely collect beetles, he systematically hunted every species in Shropshire, learning where and when each could be found. This was not the casual hobby of a dilettante, but the dedication of someone who needed to understand completely, to categorize perfectly, to know everything knowable about his chosen subject. In this, perhaps, he was most truly his grandfather's descendant. The seeds of revolution were being planted in garden soil, cultivated among dead birds and living questions. In October 1825, a 16-year-old Charles Darwin arrived in Edinburgh, sent there by his father to become a physician like himself, like his grandfather before him. The city rose from its volcanic rock like a medieval fortress, proud and cold, its ancient university claiming to be one of the finest medical schools in all the world. Robert Darwin had arranged everything with characteristic efficiency: lodgings near the university, an allowance sufficient for a gentleman's son, expectations clear and non-negotiable. Charles would become a doctor. The matter was settled. Edinburgh welcomed its new students with Scottish severity. The medical lectures began early in the dark northern mornings, held in amphitheatres where hundreds of young men crowded together, scratching notes while professors droned through material both essential and unutterably dull. Charles tried. He attended the anatomy lectures, the chemistry demonstrations, the clinical rounds at the Royal Infirmary. He opened his notebooks and wrote down what was required. But his mind wandered, drawn always back to the natural world beyond the lecture hall windows. The operating theatre proved his undoing. In an age before anesthesia, before antiseptics, surgery was butchery performed on conscious patients. Charles watched as a child was brought in for an operation, watched as the surgeons prepared their instruments, watched as the first incision brought screams that echoed off stone walls. He fled. The nightmares followed him for years afterward, those screams, the blood, the casual horror of it all. He never returned to that theatre. His career in medicine ended in that moment, though he did not yet have the courage to admit it. His brother Erasmus had accompanied him to Edinburgh, beginning his own medical studies, and together they found ways to avoid the intolerable parts of their education. They attended the fashionable social events, joined the scientific societies where gentlemen amateurs presented their discoveries, spent their allowances on books and specimens rather than the recommended texts. Erasmus, more worldly and cynical, recognized early that neither of them would become physicians. Charles clung longer to the pretense, dreading his father's disappointment. But Edinburgh offered compensations beyond its medical curriculum. The city teemed with intellectual life, debates about geology and biology, arguments about the age of the Earth, discussions of Lamarck's heretical ideas about species transformation. Charles began attending meetings of the Plinian Society, where students presented their own research without the deadening formality of official lectures. Here he found his people, young men who cared more about ideas than respectability, who valued observation over tradition. He met Robert Grant, a radical zoologist who took Charles on expeditions along the Firth of Forth, collecting marine invertebrates from tidal pools. Grant spoke openly about Lamarck, about the possibility that species changed over time, ideas that could destroy a man's reputation if spoken too loudly. Charles listened, fascinated and frightened. Grant showed him how to dissect sea creatures, how to observe their life cycles, how to think about the relationships between different organisms. These cold Scottish shores became a classroom more valuable than any lecture hall. The second year proved worse than the first. Charles attended fewer lectures, spent more time collecting specimens, realized with growing certainty that he could not become a physician. The thought of spending his life treating illnesses, of dealing with suffering he could not always relieve, of performing the bloody procedures he could not bear to watch, filled him with despair. Yet what alternative existed? A gentleman's son could not simply do nothing. The family fortune would support him, yes, but Robert Darwin demanded more than idle comfort from his sons. In the spring of 1827, Charles left Edinburgh without completing his medical degree, a failure that seemed catastrophic at the time. He returned to Shrewsbury to face his father's anger and disappointment. The interview was brief and brutal. Robert Darwin, in his massive physicality and wounded pride, pronounced his son a disgrace who cared for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat-catching, and would be a disgrace to himself and his family. The words cut deep. But in that failure, in that moment of humiliation, lay the seeds of something far greater than a successful medical practice. The world had lost a mediocre doctor. It had not yet gained its greatest naturalist, but the path was clearing. There remained one respectable path for a gentleman's son who had failed at medicine, the clergy. In October 1827, Charles Darwin arrived at Christ's College, Cambridge, to prepare for ordination as a country parson in the Church of England. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offended no one fatally. Robert Darwin could tell his friends that his son was destined for the church. Charles could postpone any real decision for 3 more years. And perhaps, just perhaps, a quiet country parish would allow time for the pursuits that actually interested him. Cambridge in the late 1820s was a peculiar institution, part medieval monastery, part gentleman's club, with scholarship arriving almost as an afterthought. Students were expected to attend chapel, master enough Greek and mathematics to pass examinations, and spend the remainder of their time forming the social connections that would sustain them through life. Charles adapted to this environment with surprising ease. He joined the right clubs, made the right friends, developed a taste for wine and conversation that his Edinburgh experience had prepared him for. But beetles became his obsession. While other undergraduates debated theology or politics, Charles hunted insects with systematic intensity. He scoured the countryside around Cambridge, overturning logs, examining flowers, checking beneath bark. He knew where and when each species could be found, understood their habits with a precision that transformed casual collecting into something approaching science. His rooms filled with specimens, carefully pinned and labeled, a museum of small lives lived and ended. One day, already holding a beetle in each hand, he spotted a rare species on a piece of bark. Without thinking, he popped one of the beetles he was holding into his mouth for safekeeping and grabbed the prize. The beetle in his mouth promptly released a burning defensive chemical. Charles spat it out in agony, losing both the oral beetle and the rare specimen in the chaos that followed. The story became legend among his friends, proof that Darwin's beetle madness exceeded all reasonable bounds. But it also revealed something deeper, the willingness to endure discomfort, even pain, in pursuit of knowledge. His collection grew exceptional enough to attract notice. Professional entomologists began corresponding with him, asking about his finds, trusting his identifications. When James Stephens published his Illustrations of British Entomology, several entries bore the credit captured by C. Darwin. Charles saw his name in print for the first time, attached to scientific discovery, and felt a thrill that no sermon had ever produced. This was what he was meant to do, not preach about salvation, but document creation itself. John Stevens Henslow changed everything. Professor of botany at Cambridge, Henslow held open house for students every week, offering conversation, tea, and the companionship of someone who took natural history seriously as science rather than hobby. Charles became a regular attendee, then a constant companion on Henslow's walks through the countryside. They would spend hours examining plants, discussing classification, debating the relationships between species. Henslow called Charles the man who walks with Henslow, and the nickname carried an honor that academic titles could not match. Through Henslow, Charles discovered geology. Adam Sedgwick, Cambridge's professor of geology, needed an assistant for a mapping expedition through North Wales. Henslow recommended Darwin. That summer of 1831, tramping through Welsh mountains with Sedgwick, Charles learned to read the history written in stone, to see how layers of rock recorded immense spans of time, to understand that the Earth had a story far longer and stranger than Genesis suggested. Sedgwick taught him to observe carefully, to record meticulously, to reason from evidence rather than authority. The theological studies proceeded adequately. Charles passed his examinations, learned enough doctrine to satisfy the requirements, could have proceeded to ordination. But something had shifted. The country parish he had once imagined, the quiet life of sermons and pastoral care, punctuated by natural history observations, no longer seemed sufficient. He wanted more, needed more, though he could not yet articulate what that more might be. Cambridge had given him friendship, expertise, and contacts. It had also awakened an ambition he had not known he possessed. When the letter arrived from Henslow in late August 1831, Charles Darwin was ready, though he did not know for what. The letter reached the Mount on August 29, 1831, forwarded from Cambridge. Charles Darwin, fresh from his geological expedition with Sedgwick, read it with mounting excitement that quickly collapsed into despair. Henslow wrote that Captain Robert Fitzroy of HMS Beagle was seeking a gentleman companion for a surveying voyage around the world, expected to last 2 years. The position was unpaid, the conditions would be harsh, but for a young naturalist it offered opportunities beyond measure. Henslow had recommended Charles. Would he accept? Charles wanted to shout yes immediately, to pack his specimens and equipment and race to London. The chance to see the world, to collect in tropical regions, to observe geology and biology across continents. This was everything his 3 years at Cambridge had prepared him for, everything his passion for natural history demanded. But his father's permission was required, and Robert Darwin's answer came swift and brutal. No, absolutely not. The voyage would be a waste of time, would damage Charles's reputation, would delay his career in the church even further. A gentleman's son did not go gallivanting around the world like some common sailor. The reasons multiplied as Robert Darwin warmed to his theme. The voyage was too dangerous. Charles would be gone too long. His position aboard ship would be ambiguous and potentially humiliating. Captain Fitzroy might be difficult to live with in such close quarters. The whole scheme had probably fallen through already, and Charles would look foolish for having considered it. Most damningly, why had the position not already been filled? Clearly, something was wrong with it, or with the ship, or with the captain. Respectable men did not undertake such adventures. Charles wrote to Henslow declining the invitation, his letter heavy with regret and filial duty. He spent a miserable day at the Mount, then accepted an invitation to visit his uncle Josiah Wedgwood at Mayor Hall, hoping the change of scene would ease his disappointment. Mayor had always been a refuge, his uncle's household more relaxed than his father's, his cousins more sympathetic to his interests. Charles poured out the story of the Beagle and his father's refusal. Josiah Wedgwood listened carefully, then surprised Charles by disagreeing with his brother-in-law's assessment. The voyage sounded like an extraordinary opportunity. The experience would be invaluable. Charles would return with collections and observations that could establish his reputation as a serious naturalist. Far from damaging his prospects, the voyage might make his career. If Robert Darwin's only objection was practical concern, perhaps those concerns could be addressed. Uncle Josiah did more than sympathize. He sat down and wrote a point-by-point rebuttal to Robert Darwin's objections, then offered to accompany Charles back to Shrewsbury to argue the case in person. This was alliance Charles had not dared hope for. Josiah Wedgwood was Robert Darwin's friend and brother-in-law, a man whose judgment Robert respected, whose pottery business had made him wealthy and influential. If Uncle Josiah thought the voyage sensible, perhaps Robert might reconsider. They returned to the Mount the next morning. Robert Darwin, confronted by his old friend's advocacy and his son's desperate hope, began to waver. The practical objections were addressed one by one. Yes, the position had real scientific merit. Yes, Captain Fitzroy was from a respectable family. Yes, the voyage would be educational rather than frivolous. And finally, the admission that mattered most. If Josiah thought it advisable, Robert would not stand in the way. Charles had his father's permission. What followed was a frenzy of preparation. Charles raced to Cambridge to see Henslow, then to London to meet Captain Fitzroy. The captain was young, only 26, aristocratic, intelligent, and dangerously moody. Fitzroy almost rejected Darwin based on the shape of his nose, believing in the pseudoscience of physiognomy that claimed character could be read in facial features. Darwin's nose supposedly indicated insufficient determination, but they talked, found common ground, and Fitzroy relented. The voyage was not to be 2 years, but 5 or more. HMS Beagle was a tiny ship, only 90 feet long, that would carry 73 men around the world in conditions of extraordinary discomfort. Charles would share the captain's cabin, serve as both naturalist and gentleman companion, pay his own expenses, and have no official position or salary. He said yes without hesitation. On August 29th, he had been destined for a country parish. By September's end, he was preparing to circumnavigate the globe. The letter from Henslow had arrived at precisely the right moment, found Charles at precisely the right stage of readiness, and offered precisely the opportunity that would transform a beetle-collecting gentleman into the man who would explain life itself. Sometimes history turns on such small hinges. HMS Beagle sat anchored at Plymouth Harbour, a 10-gun brig sloop that seemed to shrink with each passing day. Charles Darwin stood on deck trying to convince himself that 90 feet of ship was sufficient for a voyage expected to last years. Below, in the cramped cabin he would share with Captain Fitzroy, his books and specimen jars competed for space with navigational instruments and the captain's extensive library. Every available inch had been claimed, measured, rationed. Charles would sleep in a hammock slung above the chart table, his feet dangling where officers would work during the day. The departure had been delayed twice already by winter storms battering the English coast. Charles spent those waiting weeks in a state of oscillating excitement and terror. He suffered from seasickness, even in harbour, his stomach rebelling against the gentle rocking of the anchored ship. What would happen when they reached open ocean? His father's warnings echoed in his mind. Perhaps this was madness after all. Perhaps he should return to Shrewsbury and accept the country parish that awaited him. But December 27th dawned clear enough for sailing. The anchor lifted, the sails filled with wind, and HMS Beagle nosed toward the open Atlantic. Charles stood at the rail, watching England recede, the white cliffs of Plymouth growing smaller, then vanishing into sea mist. Everything familiar disappeared behind him. Everything unknown stretched ahead. He was 22 years old, had never been more than a few hundred miles from home, and was now committed to circumnavigating a world he knew only from books and maps. The seasickness arrived with devastating force. For days Charles could keep nothing down, lay in his hammock in misery while the ship pitched and rolled through winter seas. He began to understand why the position of naturalist had been difficult to fill. No salary could compensate for this particular hell. The other men went about their duties with the casual competence of experienced sailors, while Charles clung to his hammock and wished for death or dry land, whichever came first. Captain Fitzroy proved to be complicated company. Brilliant, well-read, devoutly religious, he could shift from charming conversation to black moods with little warning. He believed absolutely in the literal truth of Genesis, carried 3 Bibles aboard for different occasions, and saw the voyage partly as an opportunity to find geological evidence supporting the biblical flood. Charles, still planning on ordination himself, saw no conflict yet between his scientific interests and religious faith. They would read together, discuss philosophy and theology, find companionship in their shared education and social class. The Beagle's mission was to complete the hydrographic survey of South America's coastline, charting harbours and currents for the British Admiralty. This meant long periods anchored while boats went out to take soundings, perfect opportunities for Charles to go ashore and collect. Fitzroy had agreed that whenever possible, the naturalist could leave the ship and explore, sending specimens back while the Beagle continued its surveying work. This arrangement would allow Charles to spend far more time on land than most sailors, to penetrate inland, to observe and collect with a freedom rare for naval expeditions. Their first stop was the Cape Verde Islands off the African coast. Charles went ashore on Santiago Island in January 1832 and made his first significant geological observation. A white band of shells and coral ran through the volcanic rock 30 feet above current sea level. The implication struck him immediately. Either the sea had once been higher or the land had risen. Both possibilities suggested geological processes operating over immense time spans, forces still active, still shaping the world. He collected samples, sketched the formation, felt the first stirrings of questions that would occupy him for decades. The Beagle sailed on, south toward Brazil. Charles began to find his sea legs, or at least to develop strategies for coping with the constant motion. He established routines for preserving specimens in spirits, for taking notes in cramped conditions, for making himself useful despite his frequent illness. The other men accepted him, this gentleman naturalist who paid his own way and never pulled rank. He was philos to them, the philosopher said with more affection than mockery. The voyage had begun. The boy who collected beetles in Cambridge was beginning his transformation into something history would not forget. For 3.5 years, HMS Beagle worked its way around South America. Charles Darwin collected fossils from Patagonian cliffs, observed the devastating effects of earthquakes in Chile, rode with gauchos across the Pampas, and shipped crate after crate of specimens back to England. He had become an accomplished field naturalist, his observations growing sharper, his questions more penetrating. But nothing in those years prepared him for 5 weeks among volcanic islands that would change everything. The Galapagos archipelago rose from the Pacific Ocean 600 miles west of Ecuador, a cluster of volcanic peaks that seemed to have been born from fire and cooled into strangeness. The islands appeared recently formed in geological terms, raw and harsh, scattered with the black remnants of lava flows. When HMS Beagle anchored off Chatham Island in September 1835, Charles went ashore expecting to find geology interesting and wildlife scarce. Instead, he walked into a living laboratory of creation itself. The animals showed no fear. Giant tortoises, some weighing over 500 pounds, ignored Charles as he walked among them. Marine iguanas, found nowhere else on Earth, basked on volcanic rocks. Birds hopped near his feet, curious rather than cautious. The islands seemed suspended outside normal time, a place where evolution's experiments played out in isolation, where nature revealed patterns that the continental landmasses obscured. The mockingbirds caught his attention first. Each island had its own variety, distinct enough that the differences were obvious even to his collecting eye. On Chatham Island, the mockingbirds had one appearance. On Charles Island, they looked slightly different. On James Island, different still. Why would God create separate varieties for islands visible from each other on clear days? Why not one perfect mockingbird design for the entire archipelago? The vice-governor of the islands mentioned casually that he could tell which island any giant tortoise came from just by examining its shell. The tortoises on Hood Island had shells shaped differently from those on Isabella Island. Again, why? The islands shared the same climate, the same volcanic soil, the same essential conditions. Yet the tortoises had diverged, each island population developing its own characteristics. Charles collected finches throughout the islands, shooting specimens for later study. They seemed unremarkable at the time, small brown birds that varied somewhat in size and beak shape, but appeared to be a mixture of finches, wrens, and other families. He labeled them carelessly, often failing to note which island each specimen came from. This oversight would haunt him later when he realized what he had missed. 34 days after arriving, HMS Beagle departed the Galapagos, sailing west toward Tahiti and eventually home. Charles packed his specimens and notebooks, believing he had completed a successful collecting expedition to unusual islands. But something nagged at him. The patterns he had observed, the island-specific variations, the strange similarities between species that seemed related yet distinct. These observations did not quite fit the story of separate divine creation he had always accepted. On the long voyage across the Pacific, Charles began reviewing his notes. The mockingbirds troubled him most. If God created each species separately, placing them in the environments they were designed for, why create 3 similar but distinct mockingbirds for 3 adjacent islands? Why not create one mockingbird perfectly suited to all 3? Unless the thought came unbidden, unless the birds had somehow changed after arriving on the islands, unless species were not fixed and immutable but could transform over time, the idea was dangerous, almost heretical. His grandfather Erasmus had proposed something similar and been mocked by respectable scientists. Lamarck's theories of transformation had been dismissed as fanciful. Yet the evidence from the Galapagos kept pulling Charles toward an impossible conclusion. The islands were young, geologically speaking. The animals must have arrived from the mainland and then somehow changed, diverged, evolved. Charles did not yet understand the mechanism. He did not know about natural selection, about the competition for resources that would drive variation, about the vast time scales across which tiny changes could accumulate into new species. But the Galapagos had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a question that would not be silenced. The finches had whispered a secret, though he had not recognized their song at the time. Those small brown birds, so carelessly collected and incompletely labeled, would eventually help explain the origin of every living thing. But first, Charles Darwin had to return to England and begin the long, dangerous work of thinking through what he had seen. HMS Beagle dropped anchor at Falmouth on October 2, 1836, completing a circumnavigation that had lasted 4 years, 9 months, and 5 days. Charles Darwin stepped onto English soil transformed. The boy who had failed at medicine and collected beetles had become a seasoned explorer, a skilled naturalist, and something more dangerous, a man with questions that threatened to undermine the foundations of Victorian certainty. The reunion with his family at Shrewsbury should have been triumphant. Robert Darwin barely recognized his son. Charles had left soft and uncertain. He returned, lean, weathered, confident in ways that made his father uncomfortable. The crates of specimens that had been arriving for years had already made Charles's name known among British naturalists. Henslow had shared Darwin's letters at scientific meetings, presenting them as the observations of a promising young collector. But Robert Darwin saw something in his son's eyes that worried him, a restlessness, an intensity that spoke of ideas not yet voiced. Charles stayed at the Mount only briefly before returning to Cambridge to organize his collections. The work overwhelmed him. 5 years of specimens needed to be sorted, catalogued, distributed to experts for identification. Fossils went to Richard Owen, the comparative anatomist. Birds went to John Gould, the ornithologist. Geological samples needed analysis. The sheer volume of material represented one of the most comprehensive natural history collections ever assembled by a single individual. John Gould examined the birds from the Galapagos and delivered news that struck Charles with the force of revelation. The finches Charles had thought were different families, wrens and finches and others mixed together, were actually all finches. Ground finches, tree finches, warbler finches, all descended from a common ancestor, but modified for different diets and lifestyles. Their beaks showed extraordinary variation, heavy and strong for cracking seeds, thin and delicate for catching insects, each design perfectly suited to its purpose. And each island had its own varieties. The implications became inescapable. The Galapagos finches had arrived from the mainland as a single species, then diversified as they adapted to different islands and different food sources. The mockingbirds showed the same pattern. So did the tortoises. The islands were a laboratory demonstrating that species were not fixed and immutable, but could change, could transform, could evolve. But how? What mechanism could produce such changes? And if it worked on these islands, did it work everywhere? Were all species related through common descent? Was humanity itself part of this great chain of transformation? Charles moved to London in March 1837, taking rooms on Great Marlborough Street, positioning himself at the heart of British scientific life. He joined the Geological Society, presented papers on his South American findings, began establishing himself as a serious man of science rather than a gentleman collector. But his public work on geology masked private obsessions. In July 1837, he opened a new notebook with the letter B written on its cover. Inside, he began exploring the most dangerous idea of his generation. Zoonomia, he wrote at the top of the first page, using his grandfather's title deliberately. Then he began working through the evidence for species transformation. If all the Galapagos mockingbirds descended from a mainland ancestor, then the same logic applied to all related species. The evidence was everywhere once you looked for it. Fossils showed extinct creatures that resembled living ones, suggesting descent with modification. Domestic breeding proved that variation could be selected and amplified. Embryos of different species looked remarkably similar in early stages, as if they shared common origins. But he could not share these thoughts, not yet. The social and religious implications were too dangerous. To suggest that species transformed was to question Genesis. To propose common descent was to challenge humanity's special creation. Darwin had seen the persecution of scientists who ventured too close to such heresies. He needed more evidence, more time, more certainty before he could risk everything by publishing, so he maintained two lives. Publicly, he was becoming one of England's most respected naturalists, publishing accounts of the Beagle voyage, working on geology, establishing his reputation. Privately, he filled notebook after notebook with observations, questions, speculations about the mechanism of transformation. How did species change? What drove variation? Why did some creatures survive while others perished? The answer, when it came, would be almost absurdly simple. But first, Charles needed to stop traveling, to settle somewhere he could think and work without interruption. He needed stability, domesticity, a place where dangerous ideas could be nurtured in secret. The Beagle had changed him utterly. Now he had to change the world, though the world did not yet know it was about to be transformed by a quiet man with notebooks full of questions about finches on remote islands. In September 1838, Charles Darwin read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population and found the key he had been searching for. Malthus argued that populations grow geometrically while food supplies increase only arithmetically, inevitably producing a struggle for existence. Darwin saw immediately how this applied to nature.
Not all offspring could survive.
Competition for limited resources would favor individuals with advantageous variations. Over time, this selection would drive species to change, to adapt, to evolve. He called it natural selection, and it explained everything. Why island species resembled mainland species but differed in details. Why fossils showed gradual modification over time. Why domestic breeding produced such dramatic changes. Nature selected just as human breeders did, but with populations, time spans, and selective pressures beyond human scale. The mechanism was elegant, inevitable, and terrifying in its implications. Darwin now possessed the most revolutionary idea in the history of biology.
And he told almost no one.
Instead, he married his cousin Emma Wedgwood in January 1839, moved to London, then to Down House in the Kent countryside, and began one of the longest, strangest delays in scientific history. 20 years would pass between his insight about natural selection and the publication of On the Origin of Species. 2 decades during which Darwin sat on a theory he knew would change everything. Why wait? The reasons multiplied like the species he studied. Emma was deeply religious, a devout Christian who feared for her husband's soul if he published atheistic theories. Darwin had already observed how evolutionary ideas destroyed careers. Robert Grant, who had shown him marine biology in Edinburgh, had been marginalized for his Lamarckian views. Anonymous publication of Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation in 1844 had triggered outrage and ridicule. The author's identity remained secret precisely because the ideas were so dangerous. Darwin's health collapsed, or appeared to. Mysterious illnesses plagued him: stomach pains, vomiting, heart palpitations, crushing fatigue. No doctor could find a physical cause, yet the symptoms were debilitating and real. Modern scholars debate whether Darwin suffered from Chagas disease picked up in South America, or chronic anxiety or psychosomatic responses to the stress of harboring dangerous knowledge. Whatever the cause, illness became his refuge. He could not attend scientific meetings, could not maintain the social obligations of London life. He needed quiet, isolation, Down House, 16 miles from London, where he could work undisturbed. The notebooks accumulated. He filled them with observations on everything: barnacles, orchids, earthworms, pigeons, coral reefs, climbing plants. Nothing was too small for his attention. Each study revealed patterns supporting his theory. The barnacle work alone consumed 8 years, a complete taxonomy of living and fossil cirripedes that established Darwin's credentials as a serious, systematic biologist. No one could accuse him of being an amateur theorist when he published more than 1,000 pages describing barnacle anatomy. But the barnacles also served as delay. As long as Darwin remained occupied with safe, descriptive work, he could postpone the moment when he would have to reveal the theory that explained everything. His closest scientific friends knew some of what he was thinking. Joseph Hooker, the botanist, received cautious hints. Charles Lyell, the geologist, heard careful suggestions. But Darwin swore them to secrecy, shared his ideas only in private correspondence, refused to commit anything to publication. In 1844, he wrote a 230-page outline of his theory and left sealed instructions with Emma. If he died, the essay should be published, along with funds to ensure proper editing. This was Darwin's insurance policy, his way of ensuring the theory would survive even if he lacked the courage to publish it himself. The essay sat in a drawer, while Darwin bred pigeons, studied orchids, dissected barnacles, and filled more notebooks. Down House became his laboratory and fortress. The children played in the gardens while Darwin worked in his study, his specimens spread across tables, his notebooks stacked in careful order. He corresponded with naturalists around the world, asking seemingly innocent questions that fed his secret work. How did bees build their hexagonal cells? How did seeds disperse across oceans? Why did some islands have unique species while others shared continental fauna? Each answer added another piece to his puzzle. Emma watched her husband work himself into exhaustion over questions she could not fully understand. She knew Charles had abandoned conventional faith, knew his theories troubled him deeply. They maintained a careful peace, love, and respect, surviving despite fundamental disagreement about the nature of creation. She went to church. He stayed home and studied pigeons. Their marriage endured on unspoken compromise. The years passed. Darwin's children grew. His reputation solidified. His collections expanded. The theory sat in notebooks, in private letters, in the sealed essay, waiting for the moment when it would have to emerge. Darwin told himself he needed more evidence, more time, more certainty. But perhaps what he really needed was courage or disaster or someone else to force his hand. That moment was coming, approaching across the seas. In a letter from a young naturalist working in the Malay archipelago, a letter that would shatter Darwin's careful procrastination and thrust him into the scientific controversy he had spent 20 years trying to avoid. The letter arrived at Down House on June 18, 1858, carried by the regular morning post like any ordinary correspondence. Charles Darwin opened it expecting another routine scientific inquiry, perhaps questions about barnacles or requests for specimen identifications. Instead, he held in his trembling hands the end of 20 years of careful delay. Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist collecting specimens in the Malay archipelago, had written to share an idea that had come to him during a fever in Ternate. The essay enclosed was titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." Darwin read through Wallace's manuscript with mounting horror and admiration. There, in crisp prose, Wallace had independently arrived at the theory of natural selection. The struggle for existence, the survival of the fittest, the gradual modification of species through competitive advantage. Everything Darwin had been developing for 2 decades was laid out in Wallace's 20 pages. The young man had even used similar language, similar examples, similar logic. 2 minds, working independently on opposite sides of the world, had reached identical conclusions about the greatest question in biology. Darwin's first instinct was panic. His life's work, the theory he had been meticulously gathering evidence for, perfecting, preparing to present to the world on his own terms, was about to be published by someone else. Wallace had asked Darwin to forward the essay to Charles Lyell if Darwin thought it had merit.
Merit? It had everything.
It was Darwin's own theory, arrived at independently, threatening to make 20 years of cautious preparation worthless. He wrote immediately to Lyell in anguish. "Your words have come true with a vengeance that I should be forestalled," he lamented. "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract." The bitterness was palpable. Darwin had been working on a massive book, intended to be comprehensive and unanswerable. Now Wallace's brief essay threatened to scoop him completely. But beneath the panic stirred something more complicated. Wallace's essay was good, genuinely good, and Wallace deserved credit for his independent discovery. Darwin had always prided himself on gentlemanly behavior, on fairness in scientific disputes. How could he now rush to publish, using his established reputation to overshadow a younger man who had arrived honestly at the same truth? The ethical dilemma was excruciating. Darwin's priority was established through his notebooks and the 1844 essay, but those were private documents. In the public record, Wallace would be first. Lyell and Hooker, Darwin's closest confidants, engineered a compromise that satisfied Victorian notions of fair play while protecting their friend's priority. They would present both Darwin's and Wallace's work together at the next meeting of the Linnean Society. Darwin could submit extracts from his 1844 essay and a letter to Asa Gray from 1857 outlining his theory. Wallace's essay would be read alongside these documents. Both men would receive credit for independent discovery, but Darwin's earlier private work would establish his priority. The joint presentation took place on July 1, 1858, but Darwin was not present. His youngest son, Charles Waring Darwin, had contracted scarlet fever and died on June 28 at just 18 months old. While the scientific world learned of natural selection, Darwin buried his child and comforted his devastated wife. The grief was overwhelming, yet in some terrible way it simplified things. Personal tragedy placed scientific priority in perspective. What did it matter who published first when children died and wives wept? The Linnean Society presentation passed almost without notice.
No great debate erupted.
No paradigm immediately shifted. The president of the society would later remark that 1858 had not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries. The world was not ready to grasp what Darwin and Wallace had offered, or perhaps the joint presentation, diplomatically balanced and academically dry, lacked the impact of a single,
forceful statement. But for Darwin, everything had changed.
The secret was out, however quietly. He could no longer hide behind barnacles and pigeon breeding. Wallace's letter had accomplished what Darwin's conscience and courage could not. It had forced him to act. The massive, comprehensive book he had been planning for decades would have to wait. He needed to write something shorter, more accessible, something that would stake his claim definitively before Wallace or someone else published a fuller account. In the summer of 1858, still grieving his son, Darwin began writing what he called an abstract of his theory. It would become On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, and it would change the world in ways the Linnean Society presentation had not. Wallace's letter, arriving on an ordinary June morning, had detonated a bomb that had been sitting quietly at Down House for 20 years. The explosion was coming. Darwin just needed to light the final fuse. The book appeared in London bookshops on November 24, 1859, a Thursday morning when England was going about its ordinary business, unaware that certainty itself was about to be questioned. On the Origin of Species was not a large volume, just 502 pages, modestly bound, priced at 15 shillings. John Murray, the publisher, had printed 1,250 copies, expecting modest sales to a specialized scientific audience. By evening, every copy had sold. Murray immediately ordered a second printing. Darwin had written the book in 13 months of intense labor, forcing himself through illness and exhaustion to complete what he called merely an abstract of his full theory. Every sentence had been agonized over, every example chosen carefully, every potential objection anticipated and addressed. He knew what he was unleashing. The book's full title made the argument explicit. natural selection, working through the struggle for existence, produced new species by preserving favorable variations. No divine intervention required. No special creation needed. Life explained by natural law. The opening was deceptively gentle. Darwin began not with grand theory, but with familiar examples, the breeding of domestic pigeons. Any Victorian could understand artificial selection. Pigeon fanciers had produced fantails, pouters, and tumblers from common rock pigeons through selective breeding. If humans could modify species so dramatically in mere decades, what could nature accomplish over millions of years? The logic was simple, elegant, and devastating to traditional creationism. Chapter after chapter built the case with relentless accumulation of evidence. Fossils showed gradual change over time. Geographic distribution made sense if species migrated and adapted rather than being separately created. Vestigial organs, useless remnants like human tailbones or blind cave fish eyes, testified to evolutionary history. Embryology revealed common ancestry through similar developmental stages. Everything pointed to one conclusion: species were not immutable, but descended with modification from common ancestors. Darwin saved his most controversial implication for a single sentence buried near the end: light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. He did not elaborate, did not need to. Every reader understood what this meant. If all species shared common descent, then humanity was not separate from nature, but part of it, descended from animals, cousins to apes, products of the same mindless processes that produced beetles and barnacles. The prose was careful, sometimes maddeningly cautious. Darwin used phrases like "I think" and "it seems to me," where bolder writers would have made absolute claims. He acknowledged difficulties, admitted gaps in evidence, presented objections before answering them. This was not the work of an ideologue or revolutionary. This was a deeply conservative man forced by evidence to revolutionary conclusions. A scientist who had spent 20 years trying to avoid this moment, now laying out his case with Victorian thoroughness. But beneath the careful language burned something more dangerous. Darwin was proposing that life had no purpose, no direction, no divine plan. Variation was random. Selection was mechanical. The appearance of design could be explained by natural processes operating over vast time. Beauty, complexity, even human consciousness all emerged from the struggle for survival, from death winnowing the less fit, from blind chance and ruthless competition. The vision was materialist, mechanistic, and profoundly unsettling. The scientific community reacted immediately. Some, like Thomas Huxley, embraced the theory enthusiastically. Huxley famously exclaimed upon reading it, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." Others, like Richard Owen, opposed it viscerally, seeing in evolution an attack on human dignity and divine order. The debate would rage in scientific journals, in popular magazines, in churches and universities across Britain and beyond. Darwin watched from down house, anxiously reading reviews, corresponding with supporters and critics, already planning revisions for subsequent editions. The book was imperfect, he knew that. The mechanism of heredity remained mysterious. The Earth's age was still debated. Transitional fossils were rare. But the core argument was sound, and the evidence overwhelming for anyone willing to examine it honestly. Species evolved.
Natural selection explained how.
Common descent connected all life. These were facts as verifiable as gravity or the circulation of blood. November 24th, 1859 marked the moment when humanity's understanding of itself changed forever. Before that Thursday, most educated people believed in special creation, in humanity's unique position above nature, in divine purpose guiding life's history. After that Thursday, such beliefs became increasingly untenable. Darwin had not merely proposed a scientific theory. He had removed humanity from the center of creation, made us relatives of every living thing, explained our existence through processes that operated without purpose or plan. The world that woke up on November 25th was fundamentally different from the one that went to sleep on November 23rd. Charles Darwin, writing from his study in rural Kent, had ensured that nothing would ever be quite certain again. The first reviews arrived like artillery fire. Some praised Darwin's masterwork as the most important scientific book of the century. Others condemned it as dangerous materialism that would undermine morality, religion, and social order. The controversy Darwin had feared for 20 years exploded with precisely the force he had anticipated, yet the explosion brought relief alongside anxiety. The secret was out. The argument was public. Now he could defend it openly rather than hiding it in notebooks. The religious response split along predictable lines. Liberal clergymen, already uncomfortable with literal readings of Genesis, found in evolution a grander vision of divine creativity. Charles Kingsley wrote to Darwin suggesting that God creating through natural law was nobler than God creating through separate acts. But conservative voices thundered from pulpits across Britain. If humans were merely modified apes, what became of the soul? If death had existed before Adam's fall, what was the meaning of salvation? Evolution seemed to make Christianity's central doctrines incomprehensible. The scientific establishment divided with equal passion. Thomas Henry Huxley became Darwin's bulldog, defending evolution in public debates with a ferocity Darwin himself could never muster. Huxley saw in natural selection not just biology but philosophy, a materialist explanation that freed science from theological constraints. Joseph Hooker and Charles Lyell, Darwin's old friends, supported him publicly while harboring private reservations. Richard Owen, Britain's leading anatomist, opposed the theory bitterly, seeing in it a degradation of human uniqueness. Darwin remained at Down House, his health too fragile for public combat, his temperament unsuited to controversy. He sent letters instead, hundreds of them, answering objections, providing additional evidence, encouraging supporters, and occasionally admitting to critics that certain difficulties remained unresolved. The correspondence consumed him, but it also expanded his argument. Each letter refined his thinking, addressed new problems, incorporated fresh observations. The book had been published, but Darwin continued revising it in his mind and correspondence. The popular press seized on evolution with mixture of fascination and horror. Punch magazine published cartoons showing Darwin as an ape, playing with the obvious implication he had made himself. The Gorilla's Dilemma asked whether apes should be flattered or insulted by the suggestion of human kinship. The humor was cutting, but it spread awareness. Evolution became a topic of dinner conversation, debated in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across Britain. Darwin had succeeded in making his theory unavoidable. The international response followed quickly. American scientists, particularly Asa Gray at Harvard, became important allies. Gray tried to reconcile evolution with Christianity, arguing that natural selection could be God's chosen method of creation. European scientists translated Origin rapidly, sparking debates in French, German, and Italian. The book circulated through the scientific world with unprecedented speed, forcing everyone to take a position for or against. The attacks grew personal and nasty. Anonymous critics accused Darwin of gross materialism, of undermining morality, of providing scientific cover for atheism. Some suggested his theory was not even original, pointing to his grandfather Erasmus or to Lamarck. The charge of atheism particularly stung Darwin, who still considered himself a theist, if an increasingly uncertain one. He had not set out to destroy religion, but to explain biology. That the two seemed incompatible was unfortunate, but he could not deny evidence to preserve comfort. Second and third editions appeared within months, each incorporating responses to criticisms, each refining arguments, each selling rapidly. The book Darwin thought would reach only specialist scientists became a phenomenon. Educated Victorians felt compelled to read it, to understand what this naturalist from Kent was claiming about creation, about humanity, about purpose and design. The demand exceeded anything Murray had anticipated, but but success brought its own burdens. Darwin's health worsened under the stress. The controversies exhausted him. Letters demanding answers, critics requiring responses, supporters needing encouragement, all of it pressed down on a man whose constitution was already fragile. Emma worried constantly, trying to shield Charles from the worst attacks while knowing he would seek them out anyway, compulsively reading every review, every letter, every mention. The book that sold out in a single day had accomplished exactly what Darwin intended. It had made natural selection a topic of serious scientific debate. It had forced the question of human origins into public consciousness. It had changed the terms of discussion about life's history from theology to biology. Whether people accepted evolution or rejected it, they could no longer ignore it. Darwin had succeeded in making his theory unavoidable, unanswerable in its broad claims, even when specific mechanisms remained mysterious. The controversy would continue for decades, for generations, but the battle had been joined. Evolution was out in the world, and it would not be put back in the box. June 30, 1860, 7 months after Origin appeared, the British Association for the Advancement of Science met in Oxford for its annual gathering. What should have been a routine scientific meeting became the most famous confrontation between evolutionary science and religious orthodoxy in Victorian history. The debate between Thomas Henry Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce would pass into legend, its details disputed but its symbolism enduring. The moment when evolution fought for acceptance in the arena of public opinion. The meeting room in Oxford's new University Museum was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread that Bishop Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam for his slippery rhetoric, would attack Darwin's theory. Wilberforce was not merely a churchman but a skilled debater, a man of scientific education who understood the issues well enough to mount sophisticated objections. Richard Owen, the comparative anatomist who despised evolution, had coached him thoroughly. The bishop came prepared to demolish Darwin's theory with ridicule and scientific argument. Darwin himself was absent, as always. His health made public appearances impossible, or perhaps his health gave him excuse to avoid confrontations his temperament could not bear. But his defenders filled the hall. Huxley had come reluctantly, dragged by friends who knew his debating skill was needed. Joseph Hooker attended, as did many of Oxford's scientific faculty. The audience was scientifically literate, religiously conservative, and eager for combat disguised as scholarly discourse. The meeting began with a paper on the intellectual development of Europe, which somehow led to discussion of Darwin. Wilberforce rose to speak, and the audience settled in for entertainment. The bishop was in fine form, deploying wit and sarcasm to maximum effect. He summarized the theory of natural selection with damaging accuracy, then dismantled it piece by piece.
Where were the transitional forms?
How could complex organs like eyes evolve gradually? Why did artificial selection never produce new species, only varieties? The science was sophisticated, the objections real. Many of them points Darwin himself acknowledged in Origin. But then Wilberforce made his fatal mistake. He turned to Huxley and asked, with elaborate courtesy dripping with mockery, whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from an ape. The audience laughed. Science debates did not typically involve one's ancestry, but Victorian sensibilities about family dignity were acute. Wilberforce had moved from scientific argument to personal insult. Huxley reportedly muttered to his neighbour, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." When his turn came to respond, he addressed the scientific objections methodically, then turned to Wilberforce's question. His reply, reconstructed from various accounts since no official transcript existed, became legendary. He would not be ashamed to have an ape for an ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his intellectual gifts to obscure truth, who deployed rhetoric to mislead the public on scientific matters, who preferred eloquence to evidence. The audience erupted. Some cheered, some shouted in outrage. One lady fainted and had to be carried out Whether from the heat, the excitement, or the shocking nature of the exchange, no one could say. Joseph Hooker rose to defend Darwin's theory with passionate botanical evidence. The meeting descended into chaos, multiple speakers trying to be heard simultaneously, order barely maintained by the chairman. The accounts of what exactly was said vary wildly. Huxley's famous retort may have been less eloquent in the moment than in later retellings. Wilberforce may not have actually asked the grandmother question in quite those terms, but the symbolic truth of the debate survived. Science had stood up to religious authority, refused to be bullied by bishops, claimed the right to follow evidence wherever it led, even to uncomfortable conclusions about human origins. Darwin, reading accounts of the debate at Down House, was simultaneously gratified and alarmed. Gratified that his theory had capable defenders willing to fight publicly. Alarmed that the controversy was becoming personal, theological, political, rather than purely scientific. He had hoped natural selection would be debated on evidence alone. Instead, it had become entangled with everything contentious about Victorian society, questions of authority, religion, social hierarchy, human nature itself. The Oxford debate changed nothing scientifically. Wilberforce's objections remained valid, Huxley's defense was incomplete, the evidence was still being gathered. But symbolically, everything had changed. Evolution had been defended successfully in England's most prestigious university before an educated audience against the eloquence of a bishop. Science had claimed independence from theological constraint. The debate marked a turning point not in evidence but in confidence. The moment when Darwin's defenders realized they could win, that evolution could become not merely a controversial hypothesis but established fact. News of the confrontation spread through newspapers and letters, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By the time the story reached international audiences, it had become mythology, the story of science defeating superstition, reason overcoming dogma. The actual messiness of the debate, its ambiguities and incompleteness, vanished into legend. What remained was the image that Darwin's supporters wanted: evolution triumphant, religion forced into retreat, the future belonging to those brave enough to accept uncomfortable truths. The battle would continue for years, but Oxford marked the moment when victory became imaginable. For 12 years after Origin appeared, Darwin avoided the question everyone was asking. He had written one sentence about human evolution, promising that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history, then remained silent while others fought over the implications. Thomas Huxley published Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature in 1863, boldly arguing for human-ape kinship. Ernst Haeckel in Germany drew elaborate evolutionary trees, placing humanity firmly among the primates. But Darwin himself stayed quiet, studying orchids and climbing plants, anything but the most explosive question his theory raised. The silence could not last forever. By 1871, Darwin was 62 years old, his health deteriorating, his time for major works running short. If he did not address human evolution directly, the question would be answered by others, less careful, less thorough, less concerned with offending Victorian sensibilities. In February 1871, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex appeared, 2 volumes totaling over 900 pages. The book Darwin had been avoiding for 3 decades. The argument was inevitable once you accepted natural selection. Humans shared too many characteristics with other primates for separate creation to be plausible. Vestigial structures like the appendix, the muscles that move the ears, the remnants of a tail, all testified to animal ancestry. Embryological development followed the same patterns in humans as in other mammals. Most tellingly, the emotional and intellectual capacities humans prided themselves on existed in rudimentary form in animals. Dogs showed loyalty, elephants mourned their dead, apes used tools and communicated. The difference between human and animal was one of degree, not kind. But Darwin went further, introducing sexual selection as a second evolutionary force. Natural selection explains survival, but how to explain beauty, ornament, music, art? These seemed useless or even detrimental to survival. A peacock's tail made it more vulnerable to predators. Why would natural selection preserve such handicaps? Darwin's answer was mate choice. Females selecting mates based on aesthetic preferences would drive the evolution of ornamental traits. Sexual selection explained not just peacock tails, but human music, poetry, and the differences between races. The book's reception was predictably explosive. Darwin had not merely argued for human evolution, but placed sexual attraction, courtship, and reproduction at the center of human nature. Victorian morality recoiled. To suggest that human behavior was driven by the same instincts that governed animal mating seemed to reduce humanity to beasts. The implications for religion were even more devastating than origin had been. If humans were simply modified apes, what became of the soul, of moral responsibility, of humanity's special relationship with God? Yet the book was also more conciliatory than it might have been. Darwin argued that humans had evolved moral sense, that ethics and conscience were products of social evolution. He suggested that women's roles in society reflected biological differences, claims that would later embarrass his defenders, but that made the book more palatable to Victorian audiences. He acknowledged that human evolution had transcended purely material forces through culture, language, and accumulated knowledge. We were animals, yes, but animals who had become something more. The final years of Darwin's productive life brought smaller works, each a masterpiece of patient observation. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872 explored how facial expressions and body language revealed evolutionary continuity between species. Insectivorous Plants in 1875 demonstrated that plants too competed and adapted in remarkable ways. The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom in 1876 showed how sexual reproduction benefited plants just as it did animals. His last book, published in 1881, was characteristic of the man who had revolutionized biology. The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms spent 326 pages describing how earthworms transformed soil. Critics mocked the subject matter. The man who had explained all of life now studied worm castings? But Darwin saw connections others missed. Worms, working invisibly over decades, moved tons of soil, buried ancient ruins, shaped the very ground humanity walked on. Small forces operating over vast time produced transformative results. It was the lesson of evolution applied to dirt, and it was profound if you cared to see it. These final works lacked the explosive controversy of origin or descent, but they refined and extended evolutionary thinking into every corner of biology. Darwin had not simply proposed a theory and defended it. He had spent decades demonstrating how natural selection illuminated everything from human emotions to plant reproduction to soil formation. By the end, opposition was crumbling not through dramatic debates, but through the accumulated weight of evidence. Darwin had won not by shouting loudest, but by observing most carefully, by building case studies so thorough that denial became increasingly untenable. The revolution was complete, even as its architect weakened. Down House became both sanctuary and prison. The substantial country house in Kent, purchased in 1842 for its distance from London's noise and social obligations, had sheltered Darwin for 4 decades while he transformed human understanding. The gardens he planted, the greenhouse he built, the paths he walked daily, the study where he worked, all of it became the geography of isolation. Here, Darwin had raised his children, mourned the deaths of 3 of them, written the books that changed everything. And here he suffered year after year from illnesses that defied diagnosis and treatment. The symptoms had begun during the Beagle voyage, the seasickness that never entirely left him even on land. But they intensified after his return to England, worsening as the secret of natural selection weighed more heavily on his conscience. Violent vomiting, stomach cramps, heart palpitations, exhaustion so profound he could work only a few hours each day. He tried every treatment Victorian medicine offered: hydropathy, galvanic belts, special diets, useless medications prescribed by doctors who could find no physical cause for his distress. Modern medical opinion remains divided. Perhaps Chagas disease, contracted from a bug bite in Argentina, slowly destroyed his nervous system. Perhaps chronic anxiety, the stress of harboring dangerous ideas and facing public controversy, manifested as physical symptoms. Perhaps genetic factors, the result of the Darwin-Wedgwood intermarriages, created susceptibility to chronic illness. Or perhaps all of these combined, making Darwin's later life a continuous battle against his own body. Emma became his nurse, manager, and protector. She shielded him from unnecessary correspondence, limited his working hours, enforced rest periods. Their marriage had survived religious disagreement, Emma remaining devout, while Charles lost his faith. She worried constantly about his eternal soul, feared that his theories distanced him from God, prayed for his salvation. Yet she copied his manuscripts, organized his notes, managed the household so he could focus entirely on work. Their love transcended doctrine, finding expression in daily care rather than shared belief. The routine at Down House became sacred ritual. Darwin rose early, took a short walk before breakfast, worked in his study until mid-morning. Then came his constitutional, walking the sand walk, a path he had created around the property. He placed stones at the path's start, kicking one aside with each circuit, marking how many times he circled.
On good days, 5 circuits.
On bad days, 1 or 2 before exhaustion forced him back indoors. More work in the afternoon, then reading, family time, bed early. The routine varied little for years, the predictability helping manage symptoms that chaos worsened. His children grew up understanding that father was always unwell, that his work was important beyond comprehension, that the strange specimens filling the house were not toys, but sacred objects. Some, like Francis and George, became scientists themselves, collaborating on their father's projects. Others pursued different paths, but remained devoted to the gentle, quiet man whose fame seemed at odds with his retiring nature. The children knew 2 Darwins, the revolutionary whose books sparked riots, and the kind father who played with them in the garden between bouts of illness. Correspondence sustained Darwin's connection to the scientific world. Hundreds of letters each year, thousands over his lifetime, maintaining relationships with naturalists worldwide. He asked questions, shared observations, debated interpretations, encouraged younger scientists. Through letters, he could participate in scientific life without leaving Down House, without facing the social demands that exhausted him. The mail delivery became the day's most anticipated event, bringing fresh information, new problems to solve, evidence for or against his theories. Yet isolation had costs. Darwin became increasingly removed from normal social interaction, increasingly dependent on Emma and his children, increasingly unable to function in the public sphere. He attended no meetings, gave no lectures, participated in no debates. When honors came, and they came increasingly as evolution gained acceptance, he accepted them from a distance. Foreign scientific societies elected him to membership. British institutions awarded medals. The Royal Society made him one of its most distinguished fellows. Darwin acknowledged these honors graciously, but remained at Down House, too ill or too anxious to appear in person. The illness, whether physical or psychological or both, had shaped his career in unexpected ways. It forced him to work at home, gave him excuse to avoid controversy, allowed him to focus with unbroken concentration on his writing and experiments. Would a healthy Darwin have accomplished more? Perhaps. Or perhaps the illness, by limiting his energy, forced the discipline and focus that produced such extraordinary work. He could not waste time on trivial pursuits. Every working hour was precious, rationed, directed toward the questions that mattered most. As the 1870s progressed into the 1880s, Darwin weakened further. The daily walks grew shorter. The working hours diminished. The magnificent beard turned white, the stooped posture more pronounced, the tired eyes revealing exhaustion that no rest could cure. Yet his mind remained sharp, his curiosity undiminished, his dedication to understanding the natural world as passionate as it had been aboard the Beagle 50 years earlier. Down House had sheltered this passion, protected it from a world that might have destroyed it, allowed the quiet man to work his quiet revolution. The isolation had been necessary. The illness had been survived. The work was nearly complete. The final weeks brought a peculiar clarity. Charles Darwin, 73 years old and exhausted from decades of illness, knew his time was ending. The chest pains had been worsening since mid-March, sharp spasms that left him gasping, clutching at furniture for support. His doctor diagnosed angina, the heart finally failing after carrying him through so many years of suffering. There would be no recovery this time, no return to the sandwalk and the greenhouse experiments. The long voyage that began aboard the Beagle was approaching its final port. Emma sat with him constantly, reading aloud when he had strength to listen, holding his hand through the worst attacks, maintaining the vigil she had kept for 40 years of marriage. Their children gathered at Down House, Francis and George, Henrietta and the others, understanding without being told that they were witnessing the end. The great mind that had explained life itself was preparing to demonstrate its final lesson, that all living things, no matter how extraordinary, must eventually return to the elements from which they emerged. On April 18th, Darwin suffered a severe seizure. He lost consciousness briefly, recovered enough to recognize his family, then whispered to Emma words that revealed the gentleness that had always lived beneath the revolutionary intellect. "I am not the least afraid of death," he told her. "Remember what a good wife you have been to me." The tribute was simple, inadequate for what she had endured and enabled, yet it carried the weight of decades of shared life, of love that survived theological disagreement and public controversy. The next morning, April 19, 1882, shortly after noon, Charles Darwin stopped breathing. The heart that had sustained him through 5 years aboard the Beagle, through 20 years of hiding his theory, through the controversies that followed publication, through illness and isolation and the slow triumph of his ideas, finally surrendered. Emma and the children were present. The death was peaceful, as deaths go, a gradual fading rather than violent exit. In his study, manuscripts lay scattered across the desk, observations on plant movements left incomplete. The work would continue without him, carried forward by others, but Darwin's personal contribution had ended. The family expected a quiet funeral at Down House, burial in the village churchyard near St. Mary's where Emma still attended services. Darwin himself had expressed no preference for anything grander. He was a country naturalist who happened to have revolutionized biology, not a man who sought pomp or public spectacle. But England had other plans. Word of Darwin's death spread rapidly through London's scientific community. Within hours, a movement began to ensure that the nation's greatest naturalist received appropriate honor. John Lubbock, Darwin's neighbor and a member of Parliament, organized a petition requesting that Darwin be buried in Westminster Abbey. The signatures came from across Britain's scientific establishment, representatives of the Royal Society, presidents of learned societies, professors from Oxford and Cambridge. The request was unprecedented, controversial, and ultimately irresistible. Westminster Abbey was the resting place of kings and poets, of Newton and Herschel, the nation's pantheon. To place Darwin there was to declare that his contribution equaled any in British history. The Dean of Westminster, George Granville Bradley, agreed despite his own theological reservations. Darwin had demolished literal readings of Genesis, made human special creation untenable, removed divine purpose from biological history. Yet his scientific achievement transcended religious disagreement. England would honor its greatest naturalist, even if his theories troubled the very institution that would host his funeral. The ceremony took place on April 26, 1882, a week after Darwin's death. Westminster Abbey filled with dignitaries, scientists, family and admirers. Thomas Huxley served as pallbearer alongside Joseph Hooker, Alfred Russel Wallace and other giants of Victorian science. The American ambassador attended, as did representatives from scientific societies across Europe. The funeral was broadcast across the British Empire through newspapers and telegraph. Charles Darwin, the retiring invalid who had avoided public life for decades, received a state funeral in all but name. They buried him near Newton, the symbolism deliberate and profound. The man who had explained gravity and the man who had explained life, resting near each other in England's most sacred space. The inscription on Darwin's grave was simple: Charles Robert Darwin, born 12th February 1809, died 19th April 1882, no titles, no achievements listed, just a name and dates. The life between those dates had changed everything. No further elaboration was needed. Emma did not attend the funeral. She remained at Down House, mourning privately the husband she had loved despite fundamental disagreements about the nature of creation. She would live another 14 years, always hoping that Charles had found peace with God at the end, never quite certain whether his theories had cost him salvation. Their love had survived such uncertainty. Perhaps it would survive even death. The controversy over Darwin's burial in Westminster Abbey continued for weeks. Some praised it as appropriate recognition of genius. Others condemned it as sacrilege, placing an atheist in ground consecrated to Christian worship. Darwin himself would have found the debate ironic. He had spent his life trying to avoid such controversies, publishing reluctantly, arguing cautiously, seeking only to understand nature's workings. Yet even in death, he provoked the same passionate responses his books had generated. The man was gone, but the revolution he started continued, as unstoppable as the evolutionary forces he had described. More than a century has passed since Charles Darwin was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, and still his shadow stretches across human understanding. Every biological discovery since 1859 has either confirmed his insights or extended them. Genetics, unknown in Darwin's lifetime, provided the mechanism he could not explain. DNA revealed the molecular basis of heredity, showing how variations arose and were transmitted across generations. The modern synthesis of the 1940s united natural selection with Mendelian genetics, completing the theory Darwin had begun. Evolution became not just accepted but foundational, the organizing principle without which biology made no sense. The impact extended far beyond science. Darwin had not merely explained how species changed, he had transformed humanity's understanding of itself. Before Origin, humans could imagine themselves as separate from nature, specially created in God's image, destined for purposes transcending mere survival. After Darwin, such certainty became impossible for those who valued evidence over comfort. We were animals, products of the same blind processes that produced beetles and barnacles, our consciousness and culture emerging from evolutionary pressures rather than divine intention. The philosophical implications rippled outward in waves that are still expanding. Friedrich Nietzsche absorbed Darwin's ideas and declared God dead, replaced by evolutionary struggle. Karl Marx saw in natural selection validation for his theories of historical materialism and class conflict. Herbert Spencer coined survival of the fittest and applied it disastrously to human societies, spawning social Darwinism's justifications for inequality and imperialism. Sigmund Freud built psychoanalysis on the assumption that human behavior was driven by evolutionary instincts. The 20th century's intellectual landscape was shaped by Darwin's ideas, for good and for terrible ill. Yet Darwin himself would have been horrified by many applications of his theory. He had described natural selection as a mechanism, not a moral principle. That nature operated through competition and death did not mean human societies should embrace ruthless struggle. Darwin had argued for the evolution of moral sense, for cooperation and sympathy as evolutionary advantages in social species. The misuse of his ideas to justify racism, eugenics, and social inequality betrayed the gentle humanitarianism of the man himself. The scientific legacy proved more solid than the philosophical appropriations. Every major biological question of the past century has been addressed through evolutionary framework. Why do some organisms live in extreme environments?
Evolution adapted them.
Why do diseases become resistant to antibiotics? Natural selection operating on bacterial populations. Why do humans have such large brains? Evolutionary pressures favored intelligence in our ancestors. From medicine to agriculture to conservation biology, Darwin's insights have provided essential understanding. The theory continues evolving itself as Darwin would have expected. Modern evolutionary biology has moved beyond his original formulation, discovering levels of complexity he never imagined. Epigenetics shows that gene expression can change without genetic mutations. Horizontal gene transfer reveals that DNA moves between species in ways Darwin never suspected. Evodevo explores how changes in developmental processes drive evolutionary innovation. Yet, all of these discoveries extend rather than overturn Darwin's fundamental insight. Life evolves through descent with modification, shaped by natural selection, operating on heritable variation. The cultural resistance Darwin anticipated has persisted as well. Creationism, rebranded as intelligent design, continues fighting evolution's acceptance, particularly in the United States. The percentage of Americans accepting human evolution remains lower than in any other developed nation. The controversy Darwin sparked in 1859 still smolders in school boards and state legislatures. Yet, in the scientific community, evolution's status is as secure as any theory in science. To deny evolution in biology is equivalent to denying gravity in physics or atomic theory in chemistry. Darwin's personal qualities shaped his legacy as much as his ideas. His humility, his willingness to acknowledge difficulties, his patient accumulation of evidence, his gentlemanly treatment of opponents, all of this made evolutionary theory more acceptable than it might have been from a more dogmatic or aggressive advocate. He revolutionized human thought while remaining fundamentally conservative in temperament, changing everything while seeming to wish he could change nothing. This paradox made him sympathetic even to many who rejected his conclusions. The pilgrims still come to Down House, now preserved as a museum, walking the sandwalk where Darwin walked, standing in the study where he wrote Origin, examining the specimens he collected. They come to connect with the man who explained their existence, who told them uncomfortable truths about their origins, who removed them from the center of creation and made them participants in life's great adventure. The house is quiet, as Darwin preferred it. The gardens bloom with the same patient regularity, he observed. Nothing seems revolutionary here, just a country home where a quiet man thought carefully about difficult questions. Yet from this quiet place emerged the most revolutionary idea in the history of biology, perhaps in the history of human thought. Charles Darwin, born into Georgian England, shaped by Victorian values constrained by chronic illness, nevertheless managed to see what no one had seen before and to explain it so clearly that once explained, it became obvious. He showed that life made sense without invoking miracles, that complexity could emerge from simplicity through natural processes operating over vast time, that humans were part of nature rather than separate from it. The legacy is incomplete, the implications still being explored, the applications still unfolding. Darwin's shadow will stretch as long as humans seek to understand their place in nature, to explain the origin of life's diversity, to grasp the processes that shape them. Every evolutionary biologist works in Darwin's shadow. Every person who accepts their kinship with other living things acknowledges Darwin's insight. The naturalist who studied barnacles and earthworms, who bred pigeons and observed orchids, who spent years avoiding the controversy he knew his ideas would provoke, has achieved a form of immortality that Westminster Abbey merely symbolizes. His ideas live wherever people think seriously about life. His revolution continues wherever evidence is valued over dogma. The man who revealed evolution's secret became, in death, proof of life's most profound truth. That influence, like species, adapts and survives, passing from generation to generation, changing and persisting, immortal in its transformations.